What is a pleasure dom? Sounds pretty cool, right? If you think a pleasure dom is just about giving orgasms, you're mistaken. In today's video, I'm going to talk about what a pleasure dom is, their psychology and why they would want to be one, 9 tools that you could use as a pleasure dom, and if you're a submissive, how to be a sub for a pleasure dom. I'm Brandon the Dom, and let's dive in. Now, pleasure dom is kind of a new term that's entered the BDSM scene. For veterans of this scene, they often compare this to a service top or a soft dom or a sensual dom. And all of these labels just get super confusing, and it's a bunch of jargon and gibberish, and you're like, what the hell is any of this? Now, with those other types of doms that I just mentioned, a pleasure dom does have some similarities to them, but I think it misses the mark on just how much dominance is actually in being a pleasure dom, and we're going to expand on that when I touch on the psychology. However, for those that are new to kink or new to the BDSM world, a pleasure dom is a nice gateway entry, particularly if they're adverse to some of the more sadistic or disciplinary type doms. They're not too keen on degradation or some edge play stuff. Pleasure dom is a nice entry in. And a lot of times it's because people have the misconception that BDSM is about being aggressive or being abusive, and all of it's about hurting people or being sadistic. That is one type of BDSM, and even the sadistic type is not abusive or manipulative. Everything's based on consent. Both parties want this. It's how they enjoy their pleasure. However, that's one flavor. BDSM has an entire world of things that you can expand and explore and enjoy. And pleasure is one of those arenas. And there can be dominant submission in pleasure. So what exactly is a pleasure dom? Well, first, let's define the dom part. Dominant is somebody that takes on the role of authority, control, and power over someone else, that other person being the submissive. Of course, being a dom requires a whole lot more than that, and that's something that I cover in my other videos and my written articles, specifically around being a leader, which requires understanding the goals and desires of each party and creating a clear vision for how to reach those goals. Basically, a dom is in service of the dynamic, the mutual vision for the relationship. Now, those goals don't have to be grand. It could be as simple as reaching the heights of ecstasy in that night, or as complex as leading both of your lives. In pursuit of that goal, the dom is basically creating structure, providing safety, building trust, allowing for play and pleasure to happen, and caring for the submissive. But if we were to boil all that down into the most basic foundational thing that the dom is doing, the dom uses control in order to facilitate reaching the goals of the dom and the submissive. So control is the tool that he uses in order to reach that goal. So rather than think about different types of doms as like siloed identities, think of them more as tool belts, which are just different ways of enacting control over the submissive. As a dom, you basically get to choose which tools you want to use. And an effective dom is going to use whatever tools are available to them in order to reach their goals, whichever is most effective. So rather than have me list out a bunch of different types of doms, let me just point out the main tool that the different types of doms may use. So the main tool of a sadist is pain. They're using pain to control their submissive. A master that's inside of a master-slave dynamic is going to use obedience. The slave is to obey the master. Somebody that might consider themselves a disciplinarian or maybe a brat tamer is going to use discipline in order to control the submissive. Submissive's acting up, being out of control. They're going to discipline that submissive and put them back in line. Somebody that's a rigger and does shibari, that type of dom, rope is their main form of control, bondage. Somebody that's a more primal dom is going to use their animalistic nature, animalistic desire, just them, overpowering their submissive as a way to control them. A daddy dom might use loving, nurturing guidance in order to control their submissive. And somebody that considers themselves a caregiver may use care or protection as a way to control their submissive. An sensual dom is going to use different sensations and control the senses as their main tool. Of course, I'm overly reducing what each of these doms are, but the reason I'm doing it is because I'm illustrating a point that a pleasure dom's main tool is pleasure. The pleasure dom is going to use pleasure as a tool to control the submissive. Seeing a pleasure dom is not just, a coin-operated machine that delivers pleasure or orgasms. A pleasure dom is about taking control of the timing and intensity of pleasure, about being the ultimate arbiter of when pleasure is going to happen for that submissive, and being able to control and direct the submissive's emotional landscape through joy, bliss, shame, satisfaction, anger, frustration, all while using pleasure to control that joystick. For the pleasure dom, it's this exchange of power, the witnessing of the submissive's reactions, and the controlling of that, having them like a little puppet that the pleasure dom finds deeply intimate and exciting. Now, a lot of times when you see pleasure doms or think about pleasure doms, you just think about the dom doing something to the submissive, and a question might arise of like, is it really dominance if the dom is never being served by the submissive? And my question to you would be, who says that they're not getting pleasure or service during this process? Just because they're focusing a bunch of attention on the submissive doesn't mean that they're not getting pleasure as well. See, for the pleasure dom, they get to use their submissive basically as a play toy, doing whatever they like to the submissive. It just so happens that what the pleasure dom wants to do is to unravel their submissive from a human being into a desperate, feral, blissed out, unthinking puddle of overstimulated nerve endings. And that power trip can be very intoxicating, so much so it's more enjoyable than getting an orgasm, which may lead you to think, well, does the dom ever get to orgasm when being a pleasure dom? And it depends. Does the dom want to come? Sometimes they don't want or need to be touched. They're getting so much enjoyment out of having that control. At other times, they may be so wound up from seeing their submissive blissed out in pleasure that they may wish for nothing else than to release their pent-up energy because their submissive's reactions are just sending them into chemical overdrive. So the dom is pretty much in control of whether the submissive is going to pleasure him or not. It's his choice. See, being a dom is not about the actions that are being done. It's about how they're controlling and exerting control over those actions that makes them the dom. But why would somebody want to be a pleasure dom? As I've mentioned before in previous videos, whenever somebody wants something, they don't necessarily want that thing. They want how that thing makes them feel. So the pleasure dom isn't necessarily like, hey, I want to be a pleasure dom. They want the feeling that being a pleasure dom gives them. And the feeling that a pleasure dom gets is power and desire. See, as the pleasure dom is turning the submissive into a puddle of goo, he knows that he's the sole arbiter of her pleasure in that moment. He knows that he has the ultimate power over her. As he makes the submissive's pleasure more intense, the sub's desire is going to be exponentially turned up until they're like a heroin addict that needs their next fix. And in this way, the dom has complete and utter control over them. In fact, part of the power trip of being a pleasure dom is knowing that they turned that submissive into a puddle of goo, full of desire, just wants to jump the dom's bones to be released, be let to have an orgasm, and the dom still remains composed. It's like saying, look, I can utterly ruin you, and I'm completely fine. Of course, there's some psychological predilections to people that want to become pleasure doms, such as they might be givers, more compassionate, and have a high degree of empathy and emotional intelligence. Though I would argue that those are things that are required of any dom, not just a pleasure dom. So now that we know being a dom is more about choosing a tool belt rather than taking on an identity, let's discuss some of the most popular tools at a pleasure dom's disposal. And we're going to have 9 tools to cover. So stick with me. Tool number 1 is indulging your submissive's kinks and fantasies. The quickest way to give somebody pleasure is to do what turns them on. Pretty self-explanatory. So as a pleasure dom, you want to find out what your submissive's fantasies are and then create scenarios where they can live those fantasies out. To help you do this, I have some resources. I've made a video on 3 ways to discover your turn-ons. Those are practices that you can do with yourself and a partner. And then I also have 5 tools for communicating your turn-ons. One of those being a sex menu, which a sex menu basically has 350 items on it. You can go through and say which ones really turn you on, which ones do you want to try, which ones are limits for you and you don't want to enter into that territory. That can be super helpful for starting to uncover what turns your submissive on. So I'll link to those resources down below in the description. Tool number 2 is to do orgasm control. Remember, you have control over the submissive's body and when they are allowed and how they are allowed to orgasm. Her pleasure, the sensations that you give her, and ultimately her relief from those are all within your control. So there's lots and lots of things that you can do for orgasm control. I've written an article that has a huge list. I'm going to leave that down in the description. But some examples of things you can do is making her ask permission in order to orgasm. You can make her beg to orgasm. Oftentimes, I'll make them beg. And then when they first start begging, like, please, please, daddy, can I come? I'll often say something like, I can't hear you, or louder, in order to make them keep begging and doing it more intensely. If you're feeling a little bit sadistic or cheeky that day, you can actually deny your submissive's orgasm. So bringing them up to the edge and then telling them that they can't orgasm, maybe even ending the session without letting them orgasm. You can also do forced orgasms. So as long as your submissive is consenting, you can make them orgasm when they don't necessarily want to be orgasming. This is usually done using something like a Hitachi magic wand, where you're holding it up against them and letting the vibrations go, basically just ripping an orgasm out of them. You can set up certain rules around orgasm. So one of my favorites is, if my submissive and I haven't been together for a while, the 48 hours before they're going to come see me, make them masturbate several times, and they're not allowed to orgasm during any of those times that they masturbate. So when they finally do see me, they are very pent up. You can also use things like chastity devices. So wearing some sort of chastity belt. Some of them even have like a dildo or a butt plug that goes in them. Basically not allowed to orgasm or have sex, not even allowed to pleasure yourself unless you're with me. You can see in the orgasm control tool that being a pleasure dom is not just about getting your submissive to orgasm. It's about orchestrating when and how it will happen, if it's going to happen at all. All right, tool number 3 is edging. So edging is basically when you arouse your submissive up and up and up, almost to the point that they're going to orgasm, and then you slow down or stop stimulation so that they can come back down. Doing this repeatedly is going to make your submissive very eager to want to come. If you do this multiple times in a row, so basically edging them up, letting them come back down, edging them up, letting them come back down, when you finally do let them orgasm, it's going to be a lot more intense. And if you continue to pleasure them after they've had that intense orgasm, a lot of times they're going to have multiple orgasms, and they may even blend into one another, or it just becomes like one big orgasm, one big thing of pleasure, which is usually what a lot of people think about when they think about a pleasure dom, is just these intense orgasms that are happening for long periods of time. That's just one tool and one way of being a pleasure dom. All right, tool number 4 is to do a lot more teasing and slowing everything down. So similar to edging, where we kind of brought our submissive up and we slowed things down in order to let them come down, teasing is about basically slowing down the entire interaction and having your submissive to focus more on being touched and the sensations happening to them, and basically making their body ache to be touched, to enjoy the pleasure of those sensations. So a really good example of this is when you're going to go down on her. Instead of going straight in for her pussy, you're going to want to kiss and nibble her inner thighs. And as you move from one thigh to the other, teasing her, building up that eagerness to want to be touched, you can blow hot air across her pussy as you move from one thigh to another. And if you do this long enough, she's either going to beg you to finally lick her, or she's going to push and grind her body up against you. But remember, you're in control. You go at your own pace. She's just along for the ride. All right, tool number 5 is sensation play. As a pleasure dom, you basically want to learn how to play your submissive like a fiddle. Learn all the parts of their body and what feels good to them. The obvious action that people would do is stimulating her clit. However, putting a firm hand on the back of their neck, slightly scraping your teeth across their nipple, or slowly rubbing your fingers across their skin can also be highly pleasurable and send shivers down their spine. And your hands, your mouth, your body are not the only ways that you can touch her. You can basically use almost anything to run across her skin. That could be ice, wax, feathers, claws, floggers, fur, silk, or pretty much any household item that you can find. And you can intensify these different sensations by blindfolding her so she doesn't know what she's being touched with, and mixing different sensations together. For example, using ice and wax, something that's hot and cold, and alternating those, kind of creating a symphony. All right, tool number 6 is spanking. So spanking is not just for pain. Depending on the intensity that you do or the different type of tool that you use to spank, it can be quite pleasurable. One of the reasons that happens is because the extra blood that comes to the area when you're doing impact to the body, that blood is right near her erogenous zone. And not only is it going to be filling her ass every time that you're spanking it, it's going to be filling her vagina as well. And with all that extra blood, it's going to make touches seem much more intense and everything feel much more pleasurable. Now, when you're spanking, There's also a sweet spot that you can hit, and I'll place a diagram here on the screen, right between her butt cheek and her thigh, that kind of crease where you would sit down. If you spank there and sort of inwards towards her inner thigh, those vibrations of when you spank her are not only going to be reverberated through her ass, but it's going to be reverberated into her groin as well, which basically gives some indirect stimulation to her pussy. Not only are the physical sensations feeling really great, but spanking also taps into different types of role play and fantasies, which means that you're engaging one of her most pleasurable sex organs, her brain. Now, if you are spanking her long enough, you can actually start engaging a hormone cocktail of adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins, oxytocin, and dopamine, which basically means that you're sending her into subspace. I've made a video about subspace down below. You can find out what this space is like. It's kind of like taking drugs and being in this blissed out transcendental state, where the submissive is so focused on the sensations in their body and being much, much more in the moment. All right, tool number 7 is to use toys. So I haven't run across a pleasure dom that doesn't own a magic wand, the big giant vibrator that you can basically just place right on their vulva and send nice pulsations through their body, pulling out multiple orgasms. Of course, that's not the only tool that can be used. Dildos, plugs, various types of different vibrators that do different types of motion, and many other things can be used as a toy on your submissive. And don't be afraid to use them. Using toys does not make you any less of a man or any less of a dom. And in fact, they're gonna love it, and you're still providing pleasure. It doesn't matter that it wasn't your hand or your mouth or your dick that was the thing that did it. One of my personal favorites is using a Bluetooth vibrator, and I can basically use that while we go out in public, having that vibrator inside her and basically controlling it so we can have a little bit of public play, or I can have her wear it while she's giving me pleasure and pleasing me. All right, tool number 8, which is one that you may not have seen other places, but that's using Tantric Sex. And the basics of Tantric Sex has 3 pillars. That's eye gazing, touch, and breath work. And when you combine these 3 different elements, you can create very intimate and sensational scenes where every touch just feels very electric. And a lot of these processes help her become more attuned to what's going in her body. It gets her out of her head and gets into feeling those different sensations. So every touch becomes much more pleasurable. Now, one of the things that you can do is start learning the different ways to touch. And a lot of times in Tantra, they use the elements in order to describe these. The elements don't necessarily have anything to do with it. It's just a very easy way to remember. So a water movement is like a fluid motion across the body. You're basically not lifting your hand and you're just moving it around, kind of like water would just flow over the skin. You can also literally use water or oil or some other type of liquid so that your hand more easily glides across the skin. A fire touch is basically anything that's going to produce heat. So intense friction and rubbing, scratching, spanking, anything that starts to get very arousing, brings heat to the body. An air touch is basically when you're running very closely to the skin and you can be very, very lightly touching, kind of like a feather, or you can run it right over the top of the skin. So you're just touching like the hairs of their arm or their body. And it's just a very light touch. And what it does is basically makes that person focus intensely on where they're being touched because it is so light. Now, an earth touch, it basically deals with holding and compression. So a lot of massages and body work are earth touches. You're getting deep into the skin, moving the muscles, the fascia, and just holding and compressing. This video is going to have a ton of resources because I'm also going to drop a link down. I have an article that goes in depth about how to do tantric touch, and I recommend reading that. I also have an article on doing a full body and yoni massage, which basically focuses on massaging and slowing down and touching every part of her body, and then working your way after you've massaged the entire body. It's very relaxed. You've brought pleasure to every area. Then you slowly wake your way to massaging her vulva, doing every inch of her vulva inside and out so that she feels everything. Also have an article for that entire process, and I promise that is a wonderful gift that you can give to your submissive. All right, our last tool, tool number 9, is overstimulation. Overstimulation is basically when you arouse your partner to orgasm, but after they start orgasming, you don't stop stimulating them. And you don't let them come down from that climax. You basically keep stimulating, often forcing multiple orgasms out of them continuing to stimulate through each and every one of those orgasms. Now, the body, and especially the clitoris, can be very sensitive after having an orgasm. So continuing to give stimulation and pulling out more orgasms after that first one can either feel very pleasurable or very painful. And sometimes after a certain number of orgasms, their body may even go numb. So just make sure, if you're going to be doing this one, to understand what your intent as the dom is and how your submissive is receiving it. As always, negotiate beforehand, find out if this is even something that your submissive wants, because like I said, for some, it can be very painful. Now, after a certain point, your submissive is going to be so blissed out in that pleasure, possibly in subspace, that it's going to be hard for them to call a safe word if it's becoming too intense for them. And a lot of times you'll see them start to hyperventilate. Their breath gets shorter and they're not taking in as much air. It kind of looks like they're in pain and they might be feeling a little pain. I would recommend then backing off, slowing things down a little bit, giving them command to breathe and breathing with them. So you can bring them down a little bit and check in with them. They may be totally fine and they may want to keep going, in which case go at it. However, they may be very happy that you stopped them because they were not able to pull themselves into a headspace where they could call yellow or slow down the scene. Right, those are the tools of a pleasure dom. Now let's talk about when you might use them. I'm sure you've heard the analogy of a hammer looking for a nail. That's basically the person using the same tool for any situation. There are going to be particular situations in which using a hammer would be a lot better. Same thing when it comes to being a pleasure dom. There are particular situations when being a pleasure dom is going to be more effective. One of those is when your submissive is pain averse. If your submissive doesn't very much like pain, being a pleasure dom is still going to allow you to be in that dominant role, to experience power exchange, but not focusing on that pain side. Another time that's effective to be a pleasure dom is when your submissive struggles with valuing themselves. Sometimes for submissives, it can be hard to let someone else focus on them, to serve them, to have time in pleasure. And so using the tools of a pleasure dom can help that submissive to experience that pleasure and start valuing themselves. Now, not all submissives submit from a place of insecurity, but there are some that do. So sometimes when you start to give them pleasure, they don't feel like they're worthy of it, and they can feel a lot of shame or guilt for it. So by you using these tools, giving them time and pleasure, you can show them that it's okay to be in pleasure, that you still value them, and in fact, you're doing this because you value them. Another reason that you might use the tools of a pleasure dom is to help somebody experience pleasure, which sounds very obvious. However, there are some submissives that aren't very attuned to their own pleasure, attuned to their body. They don't know what feels good to them, sometimes to the point that they're unable to orgasm. So for those people, using the tools of a pleasure dom in order to help them gain conscious awareness of their body, of their pleasure, and giving enough room and time for them to be allowed to follow those waves of pleasure to orgasm can be a very transformative experience for that submissive. And then, as I was alluding to earlier, you can use the tools of a pleasure dom in order to help a submissive reach subspace. Oftentimes, pain is the tool that people pick to reach subspace because of the different hormones that are released when you're in pain. However, using pleasure can also help you to induce subspace, and even using a combination of the two. When you're using tools like edging and overstimulation, you have a high likelihood of reaching subspace. Now, with those things in mind, there may be times that it's not right to be using the tools of a pleasure dom. And in which case then, as I was mentioning in the beginning of the video, there's different types of doms that you could be. And rather than thinking about those as identities, like I am that type of dom, think of them as tool belts. Maybe you have a submissive that likes a little bit of pain, in which case you're going to dip a little bit into the sadistic tool belt, even though you may not consider yourself a sadist. Now, let's say that you're a submissive or you're having your submissive watch this video. How are you going to be a submissive for a pleasure dom? Because remember, being a submissive is not a passive role. You don't just let things happen to you. You as a submissive are actually taking active participation inside of your dynamic, and there are skills that you need to learn in order to be a better submissive as well. So the first thing that you can do as a submissive is learning to own your own pleasure. That would first require you to start working through some of the shame that you may have around your pleasure. And it may even mean doing some time where you're focusing on yourself and finding your own pleasure first, and then working through whatever shame comes up around that. To help with this, I have a video that I just made on 7 ways to work through shame. I recommend watching that, going through some of those, and working through whatever comes up for you when you think about your own pleasure, about experiencing it, thinking about orgasm, thinking about somebody focusing on you. So then that way you're prepared for when you're actually being a submissive for your pleasure dom. The other part of this is finding that physical pleasure, being able to kind of follow the threads of sensation. And one way that you can improve that is by doing a sensate focus practice. So sensate focus is basically doing self-touch and self-pleasure and being able to have conscious awareness through that entire session. And you basically do this through 4 stages. So the first stage is non-genital touch, where you're just exploring your body, touching yourself for a certain amount of time. That can be 30 minutes long, and basically avoiding doing any genital touch or trying to find the pleasure throughout our entire body. Stage 2 is doing that same sort of slow, sensual touch where it's exploring, but then you're also including the genitals. You're not doing it for orgasm, you're just doing it to feel the pleasure. Stage 3, you're adding in lotion or some sort of lubricant, and doing that same sort of sensual touch everywhere, except now the sensation's a little different. You're gliding everywhere, everything's a little more smooth. You can include genital touch here, but again, there's no goal to orgasm. And then finally, in stage 4, you're doing full stimulation everywhere, but now you can do that touch and have a goal of reaching orgasm. Except as you're doing it, make sure that you're staying consciously aware, that you're including the entire body, not just focusing on one type of movement and stimulation for your genitals. As you're going through this process, you want to stay connected with also what emotions are coming up. If you start having some sort of shame, you're going to want to work through that after you get done with your session. But you also want to work on whatever emotions might be positively coming up as well. The second major thing that you're going to want to do as a submissive for a pleasure dom is learn how to express yourself. As a pleasure dom, we want to basically see how our control affects you. So the number one thing that you can do to be of service to us as a submissive for a pleasure dom is to give us genuine reactions. Don't be shy, don't be quiet, don't be reserved about how much pleasure you're feeling. We basically want to see the lust seeping from your eyes and passion escaping your body. And the way I want you to think about this is see your expression of pleasure sort of as a mirror. So every time that you are giving out pleasure, your dom is basically getting intense enjoyment out of that, and they're going to want to give you more pleasure. So if you're happy, they're happy, and it just basically creates this feedback loop. So if you're being shy or you're giving out false vibes, like pretending to be into something you're not, they're going to get that as feedback, and it's going to be a bad time for you. Now, if there's something happening and you're not enjoying it, don't lie about it. Let them know, safe word, try a different day. That's totally fine. Now, learning to express yourself can be a little bit difficult, especially if you're not used to doing it. So I recommend practicing on your own first. And a great time to do this is while you're doing your sensate focus practice. As you're doing that self-pleasure, let out some expressions, breathe harder, moan a little. You can even try dirty talking if you want. The more you practice, the more comfortable you get. It's going to be a lot easier for you to do it when you're with your dom. And then as you start expressing yourself, you're going to see how much it turns your dom on, and it's just going to get easier from there. Now, if you want an example of how you might be able to craft a scene or a sex session with your submissive as a pleasure dom, I'll leave a link to the original article for this, and I have a huge scene that I've crafted out that can lead you through a process. Just use it as an example or a template, and then try and create something of your own. What would make you excited to do as a pleasure dom? Now, if you have more interest about crafting your own identity as a dom or figuring out what it is that you could be as a dom, developing your dominance, trying to get into that headspace, I offer one-on-one coaching and can help you to start to work through what your desires are, start to help you express them to your submissive, and start to help you step into your dominance. I also work with submissives as well and with couples, so if this is something you guys want to tackle together, I'll leave a link down below where you can schedule a time on my calendar. Until then, if you want to dive in right now, here's a video on the 7 traits of a good dom. This is an excellent place to start to understand what it means to be a dom beyond just giving your submissive pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and attention.